Back when I. So many great stories begin that way. Now, University Park's senior residents share stories about their lives. Their interesting experiences give us glimpses of the past and perhaps insight on the present. This time, the parents of University Park resident Craig Hullinger share stories of childhood, family, and careers.
Hello, my name is Craig Hullinger, and we're here today to conduct an oral interview with my parents, two very interesting people, Louise Clifford Hullinger and Clifford Hullinger. And there's an old Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times," and both of these people did. They grew up in rural South Dakota on the ranch land of the western prairies, and they survived the rigors of drought and grasshoppers and the Great Depression and World War II, and they're here today to tell you their story. Why don't we start with the much younger party of the two, Louise?
I guess there's no better place to start than our birth. And when we were born, we were at grandmother's house, and Dad went to get the doctor because there were no telephones, and he had to go show the doctor how to get there because the rural roads weren't very well defined either. And while he was gone, I was born, grandmother went down in the basement to throw another log on the fire, I guess, to warm the house, because it was believed in those days, and maybe it's still believed, that you had to have it warm for a new baby. And when she came back, she said to my mother, "Why, Edna, here's another one." Sort of accusatory. And that was my brother and I debuted into the world, and I was much bigger than he. And they held us in the palm of their hand to guess what we weighed, and they guessed that I weighed about 4 pounds and that he weighed a little bit less. I always seemed to be bigger and stronger up until about the time we hit the first grade. Is that enough to start with?
I think that's good. So you were the oldest of 5 children.
By 5 minutes.
By 5 minutes older than your brother, much older woman.
Right.
Clifford.
Well, I was born in 1920, July 3rd, and also in near Vivian, South Dakota, just about 10 miles from where Louise was born. My grandparents came out and homesteaded out in southwestern South Dakota in the early 1900s, like when my parents were teenagers. And they had met and married there, and all 4 grandparents and my parents are buried in the Vivian, South Dakota cemetery. So I was born on July 3rd, so my mother missed the 4th of July, and first of eight children eventually. And folks lived in a little farming or trying to farm, getting started out in life, and there was a depression in 1921 also, so they kind of started and stopped and restarted a time or two, and as I earliest remember, so was living with my grandparents. Dad was farming with my grandfather Harlan, and so they had mobile horses at that time, of course. There was no tractors, and didn't get tractors until the 1930s. No electricity. There was a telephone, which used the top line in the fence, kind of a community telephone, but that disappeared a very few years later, and didn't see it again until many years later. So that was the way it started out then, with the rural farming and all hard scrabble, tough farming, because it took a tremendous number of horses to run a farm in those times, and the places were small because you couldn't farm too fast, too much land with horses. So it was tough to make a living. Most farmers were just barely getting by.
We should probably set the pattern here that rural South Dakota, it's primarily ranch land with raising wheat, and most of the people that homesteaded came out there from Iowa, and every quarter section, it's a half a mile by half a mile square, was homesteaded by individual families, and not enough land to live on, was it?
No, you starved to death in a hurry on a quarter section, but they proved up those claims, and then most of them move away and sell their claims then to somebody who had a little bit of money and pay a little bit for the land, and eventually accumulate a little more land. And you needed 6, 8, maybe 1,000 acres, about you could handle 1,500 acres with horses and unless you had a lot of cattle to run.
I was born in 1924, and my mother had been a school teacher. She used to ride a horse to the schools that she taught. And she used to say that when she was going to school, there was a homesteader on every section line. I couldn't believe it, because by the time we came along and were big enough to remember things like that, we didn't have any close neighbors at all. Our closest neighbor was about 1.5 miles, and there was another neighbor about 2 miles away. So all of those people sold and went back to Iowa, from what I heard. Most of them.
Yeah.
Most of the sensible ones, right?
Those that had enough money to get out, got out, I think. Those that left kind of stayed and farmed and ranched. But eventually it built up a little bit, and they'd take these claim shacks that they built to prove up their quarters and move them together and cut a hole between them and have a 2-room house. And
I recall that the house that you grew up in when you had 8 children was quite small. It was used as a garage when I was a child.
yeah, and it was added on. Just these claim shacks been pushed up together and added on in those years.
Another thing that is interesting to me is that my mother, when she went to school, there were so many children, they could hardly have room in the little country schools. And when I was teaching school, we had like 7 children per country school. And those came from 3 families. It shows what a big change there was in the population of the county.
Now, both your mothers taught in one-room schools.
Yeah.
And both of you went to one-room schools. And Louise, you taught in a one-room school.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I started to school, my brother and I, when we were 6 years old, our birthday was in February, our aunt was teaching our school and staying at our house, and she thought we were old enough to go to school. So we went to school for half a day. We ran across the road, and we always had to come home for lunch because we lived so close to the schoolhouse. And that was one of the heartbreaking things in my early childhood, was that I couldn't stay at school for lunch. All the other kids did, and we thought we were missing out on fun if we went home. And then when we came back to school, the other kids would say, "What did you do? What did you have for lunch? Toothpicks?" We didn't see anything funny about that at all. I think in those days, we really appreciated school. That's where all the other kids were. I didn't find my kids that excited about school.
First year, in first grade, I started a town school in Vivian. And they had a consolidated school there of 2 townships covered, and there was then in my 2nd grade we moved Dad bought a farm about 5 miles south and 1 mile east of Vivian, and bought this. We moved there, and that was in another township, so we didn't go to the town school then. And started out riding a horse. I had to ride a little over 4.5 miles, I guess, to ride a horse. I was in 2nd grade, my sister in the 1st grade, Sister Mary, and we got bucked off a couple times, so we got a more gentle horse. And then by the next year, a couple of years later, then our 3rd sister Margaret started, and the 3rd one in the family, and so we built a little cab on a 2-wheel trailer, and protected from the weather, because a 4-mile ride back against the wind coming home from school was pretty brutal in the wintertime. So we had this cab and rode in that and protected from the weather. And still every school at that time, the little ones had a barn on the school, and the kids that rode horses or drove them would try and harness the horses and unhitch them rather and put them in the barn.
So how old were you when you were riding a horse by yourself with your sister to school?
2nd grade.
So 4.5 miles. That's interesting. And then when you were driving the school bus then with a little car?
Well, that was when we started the 3rd grade. I guess we got that, and we had to hitch the horse to get there and put it in the barn, and then Dad would harness them to start us out.
And hard for me to imagine 7 or 8-year-old hitching and unhitching a horse. They seem like too small for that.
Well, the horses were used to us. They picked a pretty gentle horse, one that you could crawl all over.
When you're the oldest of 8 kids, by the time you're 8 years old, you are a lot more knowledgeable than the younger ones.
That's true. I think our kids are treated quite gently relative to the way that people were treated in your youth.